Hello and welcome to the game pitch for Murder in the Court by the Laughing Sharks. The game will be a 2 to 5 player murder mystery deduction game. At the start of each game, the player characters are accused of murder, and each player has one piece of evidence on them directly tying themselves to the murder. The players will have to find a place to hide their evidence while also finding the evidence for the other characters to pin the murder on them. The player characters who successfully convict another player win the game, while the player who is convicted loses. Players can choose from 4 different starting classes, all with unique benefits and disadvantages, and each game will take place in one of 3 very distinct maps. The game is heavily inspired by The Count of Monte Cristo, a 1970s French revolutionary film. Players will need to gather information from NPCs such as shop owners, guards, and other civilians, but they also need to be careful not to push too hard, or they might get convicted on the spot. Players will need to gather enough evidence to successfully convict another player while shifting blame off of them. The player who gets themselves convicted of the murder is the loser. The demographic for this game is, of course, going to be history buffs and fan of murder mystery games along the ages of 14 to 30. The setting of our game is going to be 1970s France, and each map is going to be centered on 3 distinct locations within that time period: the Garden Festival, Market Streets, and a ballroom banquet. Each of them will be filled with large crowds with NPCs and other vendors, as well as the player characters. The characters are going to be able to pick from 4 classes: the noble, the soldier, the laborer, and the nomad. Each of them are all going to have distinct starting bonuses and flaws. The first main mechanic we're going to have is betting and wagering, risking items or other information for a hope of a greater reward. Players will use this by giving NPCs items or currency in the hopes that their information is accurate and is good information. They can also do this to make alliances with other players, hoping that other player won't stab them in the back and frame them for the murder. The next major mechanic we're going to add is the steal mechanic. Players will be able to lift items from NPCs or pick pockets of civilians in the area to gain items and small currencies. Items players steal can be used for a few different ways. They can use them to sell for currency, or they can use them to trade for other important information. Players will need to be careful though, because not all vendors will take stolen items, and if they get caught with a stolen item, they will need to bluff their way out of that situation. Depending on how the bluff goes, they could get convicted on the spot, or they could be set free. Trade will be another major mechanic we add in our game. Players will trade items to other players or NPCs to gain information or other valuable items. Some vendors will offer a higher trade value than other vendors, so players will need to find the right balance to get the correct information or the proper currency that they're looking for. There will be some vendors who will take offense if some player characters have stolen items in their inventory. If this happens, player characters can bluff their way out or potentially buy their way out with currency. Another major mechanic we will have is memorize. Players will need to commit to memory some of the pathing that some soldiers take, as well as other vendors or NPCs. There will also be chatter that the player characters will need to pay attention to. Some of the civilians and other NPCs will have small pieces of information that the player character can use for their benefit. Player characters will need to keep an ear out for this. The last major mechanic we're going to have is bluffing. Players will really need to disguise their intent for what they plan on doing. There will be some NPCs who they attempt to talk to will try to see through their ruse, and if players give too much of their information away, they could be convicted on the spot. Players will need to watch what they say to NPCs and other players so they don't get pegged for their murder. While we were in development for this game, a few major changes happened that vastly changed our scope of the game. We decided to add in a betting wagering mechanic and remove the find locate mechanic. How we went about changing this is the item locations are told to the players, but they will need to pay a price for them. The key here is not every item is useful to every player character. Some items will be much more useful to others, but each item will be masked in secrecy so they won't know exactly what they're going to get, so there will be a little risk reward there. This will also help us push a deduction style where you can gain allies by trading items and currency to other players or NPCs. The big risk here is that can backfire on you. If you give too much or too little to a player, they might take offense to that and they might come after you. Or if you're trading with another player, they might trust you so far and then stab you in the back. The big mechanic that changed our game was removing the attack mechanic. We felt we didn't want to have so much violence in our game, so we changed it from actually attacking players to bluffing. This changed the game from assassin v assassins to player detectives versus player detectives. And each player is a suspect in the murder, so they must be the better detective to solve the murder, with the goal to be to clear your name while making sure the murder is pinned on somebody else. We feel with these changes we still can make a good game, just a different game. Our plan is to put this game on Xbox One, where we feel a social deduction game can thrive. Similar titles to this are Beholder, Clue, The Ship, and Sexy Brutale. All of these games have fairly similar themes, and we want to try to capture that success for ourselves. The big unique elements we want to push in our game is the rich historical setting, as well as the class systems, and there's a lot of room for roleplay within this game. I hope you enjoyed our presentation of Murder in the Court. Thanks for your time.